The announcement from Moscow carried a shocking impact across the world.
Mikhail Gorbachev was ousted today.
30 years ago, the world was thunderstruck how quickly the evil empire of the Soviet Union fell apart. The USSR ceased to exist in a matter of days. 15 new countries appeared. There were, of course, many crises along the post-Soviet journey, but almost all of them succeeded in becoming countries with real economies and politics. Only one of them has been considered by some to have suffered 3 decades of disappointment. At the beginning of the 1990s, Ukraine ranked 60th in the world economy. Nowadays, it is competing with Moldova for the status of the poorest European country. According to the World Bank, real GDP data of 166 countries from 1990 until now, only 2 countries have gone backwards. Ukraine minus 36.1% and Georgia minus 0.8%.
Сегодня Украина на душу населения, ВВП на душу населения, показатель самый низкий или второй снизу, там, смотря как считать, или по показателю ВВП, или по паритету покупательной способности, или самый низкий в Европе, или на втором месте после Молдовы, да, что, в общем-то, не соответствует нашим возможностям.
While some achieved spectacular growth, for example, China increased its GDP 15-fold in the last 30 years, Ukraine seems to have been going down the drain. Once a proud industrial country, now some disparagingly refer to it as a banana republic, selling grain, ferrous metals, ore and slag. And because of this success, people are fleeing in all directions. In 1991, there were almost 52 million people in Ukraine. But by 2018, there were only 42 million left. That's according to official data. But many experts believe in reality that only 36 million remain, as many residents have in reality moved abroad. So what have the new hetmen done to drown such a country? It seems they went a little crazy as soon as they stopped having to report to Moscow. Having united with bandits from the 90s, successive presidents created a lot of oligarchs, and they divide everything according to their own interests.
Кучма, Табачник, Осыка, еще несколько людей, они поддержали идею Кучмы о том, что в стране надо создать финансово-промышленные группы. Вот это был 93-94 года. И что они как локомотивы, это объединение генералов промышленности, это объединение торговых каких-то, скажем, торговой буржуазии компрадорской, ростовщической. Это привлечение как бы денег с разных структур, плюс бандиты, плюс КГБ. И в результате получат там мощные локомотивы, которые потом вытянут всю страну. Я тогда предупреждал, что ничем хорошим это не закончится.
And this is how it happened. Oligarchs took over Ukraine in no time. Its territory turned into a bunch of fiefdoms which belonged to a private club of kleptomaniacs. The authority simply served their interests. They don't care about the economy, its competitiveness, or future of the nation at all. In 2021, Forbes magazine shocked Ukrainians when it published the country's rich list. Despite the coronavirus crisis, all the oligarchs greatly increased their income. For example, in June 2020, Ukraine's richest man, Rinat Akhmetov, was worth $2.8 billion. Yet in 2021, his wealth had ballooned to $7.6 billion. Another oligarch, Viktor Pinchuk, increased his fortune from 1.4 billion to 2.5 billion. In all, 7 billionaires fattened their wallets while most ordinary people suffered as COVID hit the world. The oligarchs are constantly greedy for the next billion. They don't care how Ukraine looks. In 30 years, foreign policy will become rudimentary. All attempts to establish good relations with neighbours and distant countries ended up in failure or conflict or both. Now a so-called elite is stimulating nationalism and paramilitary groups to garner government support. But the incompetence of the authority is remarkable. It's simply impossible to create something outside the country in these circumstances. The conflict with Russia looks like it will never end. The loss of Crimea and part of the Donetsk basin made the conflict stronger. What about the others? People used to say that Poland was Ukraine's lawyer in the European Union. Now the friendship is over because Kiev became a fan of so-called freedom fighters, including those whom Poland accuses of massacring Poles. As a result of the annual torchlight procession in Kiev and other cities, monuments to UN UIA soldiers and recognition of them as combatants, the friendship with Poland was lost. Poland ambassador Bartosz Tchaikovsky and Israel ambassador Yoel Leon criticized the torchlight procession in honor of the 111th birthday of Ukrainian nationalism ideologist Stepan Bandera, which took place in Ukrainian cities on the 1st of January. In a common statement published on the Polish diplomatic mission website, it was mentioned that similar activities should be condemned once and for all. Poland condemns the winter of 1943 massacres of Poles in Volhynia, forced eviction of ethnic Poles and destruction of entire settlements as an act against humanity. Simply put, genocide.
Преступление, совершенное на Волыни, беспрецедентное, если говорить об уровне жестокости. Речь идет об очень страшных вещах. Мы не можем об этом забыть ни при каких обстоятельствах. Преступление такого масштаба, преступление против поляков, нельзя игнорировать и преуменьшать его важность, избегая слова «геноцид». Это был геноцид, и я хочу это подчеркнуть.
However, the word genocide is avoided in Ukraine. Although even local historians say that reconciliation is possible only through the recognition of old mistakes. A friend yesterday, but a direct obstacle on the way to the European Union today. Minister for Foreign Affairs of Poland, Witold Waszczykowski, announced directly, "Our message is simple. You will not enter Europe with Bandera." But Kiev keeps to its own path. On the 2nd of July 2021, Parliament registered a project for the celebration of the 80th anniversary of the establishment of the Ukrainian Insurgent Army and the return of the title Heroes of Ukraine to Stepan Bandera and Roman Shukevich. A knife in the back. That's how the Hungarian foreign minister described the law on education, which was adopted by the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine in 2017. The rector of the Hungarian Institute in Transcarpathia called the law a return to the time of Stalin. As soon as Hungarians complained, their cultural center in Uzahorod was blown up. Radicals openly hinted to locals that they would make it hot for them unless they stopped interfering with the process of Ukrainianization. On the other hand, there was the Security Service of Ukraine, which pressured the Transcarpathian Hungarian Cultural Association.
У першому читанні в Раді був проголосований новий закон щодо застосування мов меншин. Він просто уб'є можливість використовувати мови меншин у державному управлінні, у ЗМІ та культурі. Плюс миротворець склав список з угорцями, журналістами, міністром закордонних справ, угорцями, які живуть в Україні, і їх оголосили ворогами України. Зареєстрували петицію для збору підписів за депортацію угорців із Закарпаття. Знаєте, у 21 столітті висувати такі пропозиції неприйнятно.
Hungarians were shocked by such pressure. Budapest repeatedly asked Kiev to return everything to how it had been. The pleas were heard, but immediately forgotten.
Проблема с венграми, как и ряд других вопросов по языкам, решится в Украине тогда, когда будет реально языковая политика соответствовать европейским нормам, а не псевдоевропейским нормам и национально-радикальному видению языковой политики в Украине.
Romanians also suffered from language repression. Their minority is more modest, but they also suffered the same way. Ethnic Romanians are closer to Bucharest than to Kiev, but they will have to learn Ukrainian. The scandal over the issuance of Romanian passports by Romania hit Bucharest very painfully. Ukraine has made a lot of noise, but then went ahead and issued its own passports. President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, has signed a decree simplifying the procedure of issuing passports to foreigners. First of all, it concerned Russians who were persecuted in their homeland, but citizens of other countries might also get a passport. And when Ukraine was arguing about Zimny Island, it stepped on Romanians' toes the most. Everything could have been solved in a friendly way. The Treaty on Good Neighbourliness, Friendly Relations and Cooperation had been in force since 1997. The demarcation of borders in the Black Sea was stipulated in that treaty. But Kiev annoyed the Romanians so much that they eventually applied to the International Court of Justice and won their case in 2009. They got 80% of the shelf. Ukraine was left with a piece of rock which Kiev stubbornly considered to be an island. In 2020, together with journalists, Ukrainian border guards unexpectedly visited Zimny Island. It was for the first time in 12 years. They made videos and left. It looked like Kiev officials were not very interested in the stone laying in the middle of the sea. The shelf and Ukrainian greediness were a real reason of the visit, as the shelf resources were estimated in 10 million tons of oil and 100 billion cubic meters of gas. In 2014, Kiev stopped taking gas from Gazprom. Slovakia was the only country that supplied it to Ukraine. The Slovaks even built a gas interconnector to Ukraine from the Velké Kapušany gas distribution station. That allowed Kiev to save $3 billion. Most countries would surely be extremely grateful for such a service, but apparently not Ukraine. Ukraine wanted virtual reverse flow, the concept being Slovakia buys gas from Russia, which is transited through Ukraine. Before it leaves Ukraine, they are allowed to siphon off an agreed amount. Slovakia would make up the shortfall by taking gas from, say, German LNG terminals, which Ukraine had paid for. So the idea of virtual reverse flow was good, but its implementation was not. Kiev officials filed a complaint to the EU, where they called the contract between Gazprom and the Slovak Eurostream illegal. To say the Slovaks were shocked is an understatement. Bratislava did not support the idea regarding virtual reverse. They wanted to discuss all in details, so Ukraine's grandstanding could cost Slovakia, as well as Europe, a lot in general. Unable to get what it wanted, Ukraine, like an offended teenager, made a series of demarches. First, it disrupted the meeting of the Visegrad Four, Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia and Hungary, which was to take place in 2014 in Ivano-Frankivsk. The Slovak representatives who chaired Visegrad had energy-saving projects for Ukraine. But a week before the event, Kiev announced there would be no meeting. And the last-minute cancellation of President Poroshenko's visit to the Globsec Anniversary Security Conference in Bratislava was a personal offence for Slovakia. That event is of great importance for Slovaks. The organisers announced that Poroshenko had confirmed his participation and was going to speak at the presidential panel devoted to Ukraine together with 3 other countries' leaders. Lithuania is a close political ally of Ukraine. Vilnius constantly appealed to all the structures of the European Union to help Kiev through its difficult years of 2013 to 14. Yet then we see a masterclass how to betray friends. The Belarus nuclear plant, just 50 kilometers away from Vilnius, is a huge problem for Lithuania. What does Ukraine have to do with it? Well, it simply keeps purchasing electricity from Belarus and therefore indirectly finances the project.
Будівельник електростанції Росія не лише піддала ризику здоров'я жителів регіону, але й намагається використати проєкт електростанції для розширення свого впливу. Зростаюча крихкість Білорусі означає пряму загрозу для інтересів не лише Литви, але й України. Тому сьогодні хочу прилюдно попросити владу України та її народ підтримати позицію країн Балтії стосовно білоруської атомної електростанції та не купувати електроенергії, виробленої в островці.
Back in March this year, Lithuania's government pleaded with nations not to support the Belarusian nuclear plant. Kiev defiantly refused to listen, only announcing the termination of the electricity import from Belarus in July after having a quarrel with Belarus itself. Before and during the Russian-Ukrainian war for all 6 years, Belarus was one of Ukraine's partners. Alexander Lukashenko put Ukrainian products in Belarusian wrapping and sold to the Russian market, provided Minsk as a place for negotiations, visited administration of the President of Ukraine.
Для України Республіка Білорусь є стратегічним торговельним партнером, а саме 5-тим торговим партнером в світі. Сьогодні вже говорили, що у нас цифри тут майже співпадають щодо того, що цього року ми досягли 4,5-4,6 мільярда, но не рублів, а доларів Сполучених Штатів Америки. Цього року ми сподіваємося, що це буде 5,3 мільярда.
But everything changed in 2020 after Ukraine joined the so-called Alliance of Western Loyalty from the Black Sea to the Baltic, including Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland. The first thing that Kiev did was to refuse to recognize the results of the Belarusian elections. The Verkhovna Rada adopted a statement in which the outcome of the Belarus elections was criticized. Members of parliament said that the expression of will was neither free nor fair. Outspoken MP of the European Solidarity Party, Oleksiy Honcharenko, called Lukashenko a vassal of Putin. Finally, good neighbourly relations were ruined by President Zelensky, who have unofficially annulled diplomatic relations with Belarus. On the 23rd of May 2021, a Ryanair passenger flight flying from Athens to Vilnius landed in Minsk as a result of reports about a bomb aboard. A MiG-29 fighter plane was launched to accompany the liner. After landing, Roman Protasevich, former chief editor of Next to TV channel which is considered to be extremist in Belarus, was detained. The plane continued its flight. Western countries criticized Belarus and terminated flights there. Ukraine took such actions as an example, forbidding Ukrainian planes to fly to Belarus and Belarusian planes to fly to Ukraine. The official explanation for such a step sounded like care for its passengers, but still it was also admitted that the decision was political.
Чому ухвалене це рішення? Воно, на перший погляд, може здатися політичним. І воно є таким, але воно також є безпековим. Тому що дії білоруської влади є непередбачуваними.
Little Moldova suffered enough from Kiev. Back in 2005, Viktor Yushchenko had a visit from the leader of the unrecognized Transnistrian Republic, Igor Smirnov, in Kiev. The world was watching it with big surprise. Some people even thought the Ukraine wanted to get some territory from Moldova. Then the fifth president of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko, lifted sanctions on a metallurgical plant in Transnistria, despite the fact it was feeding separatists as they fought with Ukraine. Soon everyone understood the reason. It happened because Ukraine kept exporting scrap metal to Transnistria using the intermediary connected with the local oligarch Volodymyr Plakotynyuk. This man is understood to be Poroshenko's business partner. Everything was suddenly clear. And finally, Zelensky's administration severely embarrassed itself in Moldova. The story of Judge Shahaus's kidnapping is obvious. Kishinev conducted an investigation and found that the people who ordered and made it happen were from Ukraine. Judge Chaus disappeared in Kishinev on the 3rd of April. He was hiding there because in Ukraine he was suspected of corruption. Chaus was seeking asylum. Legal cases were prepared against him, but there was no final sentence. In 2016, Chaus was caught taking a $150,000 bribe. Judicial immunity helped him to run away abroad and avoid imprisonment. In an interview, Maida Sandu, new president of Moldova, said the situation with Judge House's kidnapping had damaged relations with Ukraine. Alexander Stoyanoglo, Prosecutor General of Moldova, recently announced the termination of the House case investigation. According to the police, Ukraine's special services were involved in the kidnapping. Surprisingly, it turns out it is possible to screw up not only in the neighborhood, but also far away as well. Who would have thought that Kiev would dare to publicly slap the USA in the face? Famous political lobbyist Paul Manafort was sentenced to 7.5 years of imprisonment for meddling in the USA presidential elections in 2016. It turned out that Manafort, as well as many other people who ordered server hacking of the Democratic Party, were operating in Ukraine. This information was provided by documents of the USA Ministry of Justice. The case of Hunter Biden, the current US president's son, immensely affected Ukrainian-American relations. President Zelensky tried to find some excuses, but nothing good came out of it. His office kept asking for an official visit to Washington, but as of now, it still hasn't happened. Hunter Biden found himself in the center of a political scandal after Donald Trump's phone call with Volodymyr Zelensky. Trump was demanding Ukraine reopen the investigation against Burisma, the company whose board of directors included Biden Jr. Before this phone call, Trump suspended the transfer of $400 million for military help in Ukraine, and his representatives believe that Zelensky's visit to the White House had something to do with the success of Trump in reopening the investigation. But that is not all. Recently, David Arakhamia, chairman of the pro-government Servant of the People Party, enthusiastically congratulated the Chinese Communist Party of its 100th anniversary, expressing his fascination in the party's achievements and even offered China opportunities in Ukraine. That wouldn't be so bad if the United States had not declared China the #1 threat to its national interests.
Мне посол Китая подарил собрание сочинений, книги господина председателя. Я читаю, и я восхищаюсь.
And all this nonsense was taking place at the time when Zelensky was preparing for a possible visit to the USA. Though with China itself, Ukraine scored an epic own goal. It deprived the Chinese the chance to buy controlling stake in Motor Sich after they'd invested billions of dollars in its development over 5 years. The annual general meeting that was supposed to make the decision about the sale of the majority stake in Motor Sich joint stock company was stopped by the SSU. The National Security Council of Ukraine stated that the enterprise would not be sold off, but instead would be nationalized. Chinese investors of Motor Sich called such attempts unacceptable and threatened lawsuits. To get them under control, President Volodymyr Zelensky imposed sanctions. And having argued with most of its former partners, Ukraine got stuck. The West or the East? Praise of the Chinese communists from the Servant of the People Party were definitely not in vain. It was a courtesy to a possible creditor, which could give big money instead of the stubborn IMF. The West gives help only in exchange for reforms, and there are less and less of those. The icing on the cake is the recent blackmail of Zelensky at the international conference in Batumi. The Ukrainian leader was scarring Europe with the threats from the north after criticizing the Eastern Partnership format.
Відсутність з боку Євросоюзу стратегічного бачення цілей східного партнерства робить цей формат не таким предметним, напівживим. Нам не потрібен саміт заради саміту. У нас гинуть люди. У нас війна. Нам потрібне політичне наповнення та геополітичне бачення майбутнього цієї ініціативи. Інакше, чесно кажучи, не зрозуміла доцільність цього взагалі. Наступний саміт має показати чітке бачення відносин з найближчими партнерами з боку Європейського Союзу.
Zelensky's predecessor Poroshenko did exactly the same. However, the current Ukrainian government went even further. There are no general phrases anymore. Instead, there are direct accusations of European leaders who organized the European Union agenda. Zelensky's office directly blamed Germany for surrendering Ukrainian interests.
Пані Меркель 7 років трималася, але наприкінці все ж таки трохи здала українські інтереси на користь Росії.
Needless to say that the head of the ruling party, David Arakamya, is complaining to the whole world that Ukraine got rid of nuclear weapons. According to him, keeping it would make it possible to scare everyone around them and demand money. We could blackmail the whole world and we could get money for its maintenance the same way as it happens in many other countries around the world. This is what the current government representative said. Ukraine is clowning around in front of the West. It constantly keeps whining and at the same time admits that external management and foreigners taking key positions is nonsense. Almost all Western guest workers have been removed. The last ones were recently kicked out of a Naftagaz national joint stock company along with the head of the management. The head of the supervisory board was fired in contradiction to many laws. Even the United States Department of State protested. So are any good neighborly relations possible, taking into account such actions? Probably not. Obviously, the only thing that inhibits the civilized world from giving up on Kiev is the understanding that the good-for-nothing political elite is not the whole country. There are many ordinary people who are very unhappy. In 2020, Ukraine entered top 5 of the most unfortunate countries of the world. Total happiness index of the Ukrainians in 2020 was 14%. In 2019, this index was twice as high at 33%. According to researchers, the economy and happiness of people are not always interconnected. Sometimes it is possible to live in a poor country and still be satisfied with life, as we can see with residents of Costa Rica or Panama, for example. However, Ukraine is both poor and miserable. The community understands that Ukrainians are trusting, romantic, and believe in a brighter future that the next Messiah will bring. Current President Zelensky is proof of such expectations. Unfortunately, dreaming has bad consequences, because already for 3 decades, leaders chosen by the people have been leading Ukraine into an abyss.